The scenario for our next service decorator is this. I want to show the user how many characters they have typed into the input for the alert message, which sounds easy enough to do. All I need is a data binding expression that looks at model.alertMessage.length, but oops, I have a typographical error. I forgot the E here. But back in the UI, there's no visual indication of an error. There's not even an error logged into the console of the developer tools. And if you've worked with Angular for any length of time, you'll already know that Angular is very forgiving about data binding expressions, and that has a good side and a bad side. The good side is that I might be waiting for this piece of information to come back from an API call that I made to my server. So the data will be there eventually, but until it shows up, I don't want to have to use all sorts of expressions in the view to check if something is null or undefined. I just want Angular to ignore the fact that I'm dereferencing something on an undefined property and just keep the application working. But the downside to that behavior is that if I do have a true error, like a typographical error, or I refactored the model and I renamed this property, then there's no indication anywhere in the browser that something is wrong. What I'd like to do is build a component that will show me in the console what every data binding expression on this page is producing. Now on this page we only have one, but the reason I don't want this information to go into the alerts area that we have is you can certainly have pages that have dozens of data binding expressions. You don't want all that information overwhelming the display. I just want to log this information into the console so I can visually inspect it and see, oh, here's a data binding expression that didn't produce a value. Maybe I should investigate that. To get this behavior, I'm going to build another decorator. So I want to use provide and tell it that I'm going to create a decorator for the interpolate service. Because every binding directive that you have in a view, whether it's an ngBind directive or it's a binding expression between two curly braces, Angular will go to the interpolate service and ask the interpolate service to parse that expression and produce a function that Angular will invoke every time it needs to update the DOM with a new value. So for every binding expression on the page, Angular will call into interpolate, and interpolate will give back a function. That function gets invoked every time the data binding expression is reevaluated. So I'm going to need to decorate the service and also decorate the functions that it returns so I can inspect the values that are being produced. But first, let's decorate the service. I'll need to take $delegate once again, and I'm also going to take $log because we're going to be writing into the console and not handing these things off to the alerting service. Now, interpolate, much like exception handler, is just a function. So ultimately what I need to do is I need to write a function that will be a wrapper for interpolate, and then return that function so it effectively becomes the interpolate service. And there's one additional little step here, which is that because in JavaScript functions are objects, functions can have properties and methods attached to them. In fact, every function will. But Angular adds some special properties to interpolate, and what I'm going to need to do to have my function look just like interpolate is use angular.extend to copy into my service wrapper all those things that come with delegate. So now service wrapper will look just like the interpolate service. Now, unlike exception handler, where I created a function that took parameters because I knew exactly how many parameters were coming in, and I needed to inspect those parameters, what I'm going to do here is just invoke the original delegate function using JavaScript's apply. So apply will invoke the original interpolate service, and I will pass in this, my current context, and also arguments, the implicit variable that you have inside of every JavaScript function that represents all of the arguments that were passed to this function. So I don't need to explicitly add those here. I'm just going to pass them through. I don't care what they are. Well, actually, I do care about one of them. However, when I invoke the original interpolate service, it will give back a binding function. And what I will need to do to inspect the results that a binding expression yields is wrap also this binding function. So I'm going to check if this function is a function, and there's a helper method on Angular to do that. And I'm going to check if I have something in arguments sub 0. So what is in arguments sub 0? Well, if you have a binding expression like model.alertMessage.length, that will be argument sub 0 to the interpolate service. And I want to make sure that not only is this a function, but also that that expression is there before we build a wrapper for this binding function. Otherwise, I'm just going to return the original binding function. But in this scenario, what I want to do is return a wrapper for that binding function, something that will wrap that function, and we'll pass an argument sub-0, which is the binding expression. So what is binding wrapper? Binding wrapper will be a function that takes the original binding function and takes the binding expression, and it will return a function. Because again, we're essentially decorating a function, in this case the function that is used to evaluate every data binding expression. And so when I want to see the result of a data binding expression, I can just call the binding function. Again, we'll use JavaScript's apply and just pass through the arguments that are available, and that will give me the result that ultimately goes on the screen. I can just return that result. But I also want to see it in the console. So in between getting the result and returning the result, let's do some logging. The first thing I will do is trim that result, just because when you have a binding expression like we do back here in shell.html, the result of this expression will also include all of the white space that we have inside of here. Because a binding expression basically sets the text content of an element, and since white space might be significant for some elements like pre, Angular's binding expression actually takes all of that into account. So I don't want to see all of that in the console. I'm going to trim it. And then I need to decide how I want to log it through the logging service. Do I just want to use log.info, which produces a normal console message, or do I want to use log.warn, which will show up as a warning in the console? Well, let me create a variable that will essentially be a pointer to one of those two methods. So if trimmed result is truthy, so it's a string that contains a value, let's just point to log.info. So it's really just an informational message. Otherwise, point to log.warn. So this will show up as a warning. And then I'm going to call that log method on the log service and pass in a string that will show me the binding expression equals and the trimmed result. And of course, I will just need to do proper string concatenation here. So this service wrapper should provide us some insight into what the data binding expressions are doing on a page and also when they get evaluated. So let me do a refresh, and I can see that I'm getting warnings. I can see that model.alertMessage.length with the missing E is not producing a value. And I can also see a lot of white space here in the binding expression. So let's make sure that the binding expression is also trimmed. And then let me fix my view. Let me put an E in here, save everything. Let's refresh the browser. And now I can see a 0 appear in the UI. I can see information logged to the console that shows me that model.alertMessage.length produced the string 0. And if I start typing in here, I can see I'm up to 8 characters, and that binding expression was evaluated twice for every keystroke. So not only can this service decorator give you some insight into when you might have a bad binding expression, but it can also show you how many times these expressions are evaluated and exactly what results they are producing. I've found it to be a very useful debugging tool.